Welcome back to my kitchen. We're cooking with another book today. Today's book is The Bread Pet, a sourdough story by Kate DePalma. And this is a story of a little girl, and her uncle is getting ready to go on a trip. And so he asks if she can watch his bread pet. So she thinks that's pretty exciting. Sure. He shows her how to feed it each day. So he's gone for a while, and so each day the girl feeds the bread pet, the AKA the sourdough starter, and each day it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing because sourdough starter is alive. And she's like, what to do, because there's just all of this bread pet that just keeps getting bigger and bigger, the sourdough starter that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So she has an idea, and she asked her mom, she's like, do you think that Uncle would mind if we used some of it and baked some bread? And so mom thinks that's a great idea. So they bake bread and they start to share it with the community. But this sourdough starter just keeps multiplying. And so then she has the idea to go back to the community center and start handing out the sourdough starter, the bread pet, to other people and showing them how to bake their own bread. Again, this is wonderful because the community is starting to share in this bread baking adventure. But the bread pet still keeps growing. Finally, Uncle comes back and he's like, oh, didn't I tell you you have to put it in the refrigerator? And so that's the thing about a sourdough starter. Your sourdough, you will have to feed it every single day if you keep it out on the counter. However, if you put it in the refrigerator, it kind of puts it to sleep. And so you really only have to feed it about once a week and can put it back in the refrigerator. The other key thing that some people forget to mention is that each time you feed your sourdough starter, you need to discard half of it before you start. Before you feed it again. And that way it keeps it more manageable. So two things. One, even if you're keeping it on the counter, I've been keeping one on our counter since October, I think, September or October. I think September. It was whatever day Queen Elizabeth's public service was. That was the day that I started my sourdough starter. And some people like to name their sourdough starter. I named mine the Queen because it was the day that the Queen was laid to rest. So I think that maybe it would have been September. And I have not refrigerated my original starter since then. I have been discarding each day and feeding it each day and baking bread all of this time. Now that we're getting closer to spring, summer, I probably will start to refrigerate it and feed it once a week because I don't think that I'll be baking bread as often as we start to get in kind of to the busier season of spring and summer. But who knows? We may. I started mine completely from scratch. I did not get a starter from someone else. I started the process from scratch, and it took a while. Most people say, it takes a couple weeks. It took a solid 2 months for me to be able to bake bread with my sourdough starter. In the meantime, you can do things with the discard. You can make other kinds of breads that have yeast in them. You can make pancakes and crackers and all sorts of things with the discard. So anyway, long story short, I think sourdough is a super fun. I have really enjoyed baking bread. I highly recommend it. It's really not as intimidating as it sounds. I know I definitely was intimidated initially. In fact, I started one starter right when the pandemic hit, and I didn't think that it was doing well, and I tossed it, and that was the end. But then in 2022, I guess, I decided I am going to figure this out and I'm going to do it. And I did. And then once I did it and really understood the steps, I think the key is finding somebody whose advice sounds solid and easy to follow and stick with that person, because there is a little bit of flexibility, I guess, in how you do it versus exact measurements and measuring by grams, which is what I do, or just doing like, you know, a quarter cup of this, quarter cup of that. But it gets confusing when too many voices get in the mix. So I say find one person who seems solid and go with that person. I'll leave a link below of who I kind of followed for my starter information. So this book aptly has a guide on how to start your own starter and then how to bake a loaf of bread. Honestly, I enjoyed the story, but when I read the directions for baking the bread, I felt like there were some steps that were kind of missing or not super clear, especially at the beginning when it says to take your hungry bread pet. It's not really clear on whether or not that is discard or if it is bubbly active bread pet. So I didn't feel like that was super clear. So I have a trusted recipe that I like to use with my discard, and I have a lot of discard right now. So I'm going to show you how to do a sourdough loaf with discard, meaning that it is going to use some yeast to help with the rise. Personally, I found my family has not quite adapted to the texture of pure sourdough yet. So we're kind of weaning our way into it, and I'm still using, in a lot of the bread recipes that I do, still using a little bit of yeast. Using a little bit of yeast also cuts down on your rise time, because if you're simply using sourdough, it's can take up to 12 hours, maybe even a little more for that first rise, versus if you have some yeast in it, it's going to be quicker. It's going to be maybe an hour or two. So I am going to share the recipe, I'll link it below, of the sourdough sandwich loaf that my family likes. There's lots of different sourdough loaves that you can make with the traditional, I think they call it bowl, which I really enjoy with that nice crusty exterior. But today we are gonna do a sourdough loaf that does have a little bit of yeast in it. That's the recipe I'm gonna share. And we're gonna do it based on the bread pet. So let's get. All right, so we are going to make a recipe that I have made countless times since last fall, and that is a sourdough discard sandwich loaf. So the first thing that we are going to do is, in our mixing bowl, we are going to add, let me shut this off and get it to reset. There we go. We are gonna add our discard. So the discard is what you pour off before you feed your sourdough starter. So this sourdough starter I fed yesterday evening. It's now the next day in the morning, and it hasn't, what will happen is when you feed it, it will grow. And then once it kind of gets to its peak, then it will start to fall back down. So this one this morning is still raised a little bit, but you can see it was probably all the way up to here when it was fully active. And then throughout the night, it started to fall. It would still, if I left it, it would still fall some more because it's only been maybe 15 hours since I fed it. But it doesn't matter. This would still be considered discard because it started to fall. So what I need to do is I need to feed this again today, unless I was going, well, I would need to feed it even if I decided I wanted to put it in the refrigerator and let it go to sleep. But I'm not. I'm going to keep mine active on the counter. So I want to pour off half. Now for this recipe, I need 100 grams of discard. So I'm going to pour off what I can in here. And I don't know if you can really see. You can see it's nice and bubbly. As it starts to fall more, you'll lose that bubbliness. So we are going to use, we're going to see how much we can get if we pour about half off here. And then I have some more discard that I keep in, whoops, I just made a mess. Big mess. All right, so that was about 79 grams. So let me wash my hands. I need about 20 more grams, so I'm gonna pull out my discard from the refrigerator. And I'm gonna make up the difference. So what I do is I just keep this little container in the refrigerator and add my discard to it daily. And then I make things like pancakes or other sourdough discard bread, like multiple loaves. I've made crackers with it. There's all sorts of things that you can do with it with lots of recipes. All right, so I have my sourdough starter grain here. To this, I'm gonna add flour and water. Then I'm going to take it over to my mixer and just mix it until it's incorporated. It's gonna be real shaggy. I'm gonna put a towel over it and let it sit for 30 minutes. So we're gonna go ahead and add our flour. As soon as we get this mixed up, I will come back to feeding our starter and show you how we do that. And so the other thing we're gonna add is our water. This is warm water, not hot water, warm water. Almost there, so I'm gonna slow down a little bit so I don't go over. All right, so there we go. Now we're ready to take this over to the mixer. Okay, we just mixed that until it was all combined, but it's super shaggy. So all we're gonna do is we're just gonna cover this up and let it sit for 30 minutes. They call this autolyse, something like that. What it's doing during this is the flour is absorbing all of the water. So after this sits for 30 minutes, we're gonna add a couple of more ingredients. So we are gonna add yeast so that this is a quicker bread. Because we are using discard, the sourdough isn't super active, so we won't get that rise like we would with adding yeast. So we're gonna add yeast. Plus the other thing with adding yeast is that we're speeding up the time of that first rise. Typically when you make sourdough bread without using yeast and you're just using your sourdough as kind of your leavening or your agent, your first rise will take, usually takes overnight, takes like 12 hours. So by using yeast, we're not doing that. But then technically it isn't true sourdough, but I'm okay with that. All right, so we're gonna prep the other ingredients that we're going to add to this in 30 minutes when we need it. So we need salt, sugar, butter, and yeast. And so you want to take your unsalted butter out so that it can start to get to room temperature. Save your wrapper when you take your wrapper off, because you can use this to help grease your loaf pan that you're going to cook your bread in. When you grease, or butter, I should say, your loaf pan, you definitely want to use butter. I tried it once with a spray and it was disastrous. The bread stuck completely and my whole loaf fell apart. So you definitely want to use butter. So I use the wrapper from the butter, but then I take almost another half tablespoon of butter and make sure I just coat that pan really, really well, so that 1, your loaf will brown, and 2, it will come out of your pan super easy. So I'm gonna get a little bowl and I am going to measure out our salt and our sugar and our yeast. And that way I'll just be able to pour it right into the bowl when we start to go and knead it in 30 minutes. And we're gonna knead it. You could do it by hand. I prefer just to use the dough hook on my KitchenAid, because then I can walk away from it and that's great. So we are going to, add the butter, the sugar, the salt, and the yeast, and we're gonna knead it for about 6 minutes or so. And then we are gonna turn it out into a glass bowl and we will let it rise. It's only going to take probably about an hour for it to do its first rise. So let's get to measuring out the sugar, salt. So I just keep my yeast in the refrigerator. And the extra yeast, I buy it in bulk. I keep in the freezer. To this, we are going to add 10 grams of salt and 20 grams of sugar. And in goes our sugar. And I went just a tad over. I'm gonna pinch from the top. So that is ready. My butter is softening. As soon as my 30 minutes are up, we will add it to our mixture. All right, so now we need to feed our starter. And there are different proportions depending on who you follow. I found what works really well for me is you want about half discard, which is about 40 grams. I shouldn't say half. I poured probably a little more than half off. But we have about 40 grams in here. And to this, I'm going to add 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. And then I'm going to stir this together with something that is not metal. I just use a little chopstick. So there's our 40 grams of flour. Our water is treated water because we live in the suburbs, so we don't have well water or anything. So what I do is I just keep a cup of water on my counter. And then when it gets low, I just refill it in that way. And then I just cover it with a little paper towel, and that allows like the chlorine to kind of evaporate out of it. Because if you're just using regular tap water, it could kill your starter. So to avoid that, that's what I do. And then I just cover it back up and I just keep this over on my counter. Now all I do is I take my chopstick and I just give it a stir. It's going to, you want it to kind of have the consistency of pancake batter. So you just want to make sure that it's thoroughly incorporated. I will scrape down the sides usually. You'll see how it starts to get kind of crusty cakey at the edge here. Probably tomorrow when I do this, I'll pour into a fresh container. You don't have to pour into a fresh container every day, but just when it kind of starts to get gunky up there, it's a good time. So you can see it's kind of the consistency of pancake batter now. So I have that all incorporated. I just take a lid and just set it on the top. I don't screw it on. It's just a loose lid to keep things out of there, but it can still breathe a little bit. And then I just set this over on my counter. And later today, we will be able to see that it has risen quite a bit in that mason jar, probably almost up to the top, not quite. Then I just rinse this off, and that is that. So we're gonna wait for our 30 minutes and then get on to the next step of adding our other ingredients, kneading that for about 6 minutes. Then we will transfer it to a glass bowl, cover it, and let it rise until it doubles. So I will be back in a little bit. All right, it's been 30 minutes, so we are ready to knead. So in goes our yeast, sugar, and salt, along with our butter. We're gonna save this wrapper to help grease our loaf pan. And we are just going to let this go for 6 minutes. So I'm going to set the timer. It has been about 6 minutes. So I'm going to take our dough out. And we're just gonna form it into a ball. And then we are ready to put it into a glass bowl. I'm just kind of tucking the ends in under here, but it's nice and smooth. It's like playing with Play-Doh. All right. Got our ball into our glass bowl, it is going to go. Going to cover this with a piece of plastic wrap. This will just help it from getting dry on the top. So we'll just loosely cover that, and I'm gonna go ahead and put a towel on top of that. And this just needs to set someplace draft free and warm. Because it has yeast in it, it's probably only gonna take about an hour or so for it to double. In the wintertime especially, I like to just put mine in my microwave that's not on and just let it sit in that and that for it to be kind of a proofing box. So that's what I'm gonna do. And we will check that in about an hour to see if it has doubled, and then we'll be ready to turn it out and form it into a loaf. Put it into our loaf pan, which I have greased with butter already, so that's ready to go, and let it do its second rise. So I'll see you in about an hour. All right, it's been an hour and we have almost doubled in size. So I'm gonna take the plastic wrap off, but I'm gonna save it for our next rise. And we are gonna dump this out with this top now becoming the bottom. And we'll just kind of have to coax it out gently. There we go. All right, we are going to gently kind of stretch and press this out into a rectangular shape. And then we are gonna do a tight roll from the short end and shape this into our loaf size. All right, so here we go. I am really just tightly rolling and tucking all the way up. Kind of popping any big bubbles along the way. Because we have, this got super long. I'm gonna kind of give it a little tuck under on the ends. And I am just trying to get a nice tight kind of dome shape there by tucking, kind of pulling it towards me. And then this is going to go into our generously buttered pan, loaf pan. And then we are gonna cover it back up with a plastic wrap, and we're gonna let it go again for another probably about 45 minutes, maybe up to an hour. And there it goes. And just not tightly seal the plastic wrap, just kind of drape it over. So if it starts to rise above the pan a little bit, that will be fine. Just cover it. And this time, instead of putting it back into the microwave, I've turned my oven on to 350 degrees because that's what we're going to bake this loaf at. So I'm just gonna set this on top of the stove and just kind of let that heat kind of start to do its thing for it to rise. So I will check it again in a little bit before we stick it in the oven to bake. It has been about 30 minutes and it has gotten a good rise on it. So I spritzed it with some water, and into the oven it is going to go for 40 minutes. So we will check on this in just a little bit. Yum just came out of the oven. So it is on a cooling rack, and I'm gonna put a towel over it. This is the Same clean towel that we used when the loaf was rising. I like to put a towel over the hot loaf because it will keep it nice and soft. It almost creates like a little steam inside, and it has more of that feel of a store-bought loaf. Looking good, looking good. Ready for a sandwich. I can't wait to cook with you next time when we are in the kitchen cooking book by book. See you next time, friends.